building he owned, and had a
I see.
perfectly nice bedroom and bath and everything. We were fine, no problem. I don't think it was, somehow it was close to those freezers. That's where we stayed, but that may just be in my imagination because my mind was close to the freezers.
I think actually they had a power failure there a number of years later. A lot of the specimens disappeared. Or a freezer failure, or something like that.
Well, all that has gotten so much more controlled, and,
well,
and rightly so, I mean.
Yes.
You really make me smile, Vic. You make me smile and thinking about all these things that I haven't really thought about in so long. And some of these, well, sort of pleasant adventures, epidemiologic adventures, and the people, those, again, the fine people that we talked about, and those students.
That's what I've enjoyed about doing this history. I mean, I have so many fond memories. Of course, it goes back before my personal memories, but I have the personal ones as well. Let me see what some of the other things I wanted to ask you about. Be sure I don't miss the early ones. So, what were your primary, I mean, you've told me about some of the research projects you were in. What were some of your other primary activities? You started teaching your cancer course, but you weren't in cancer initially, were you? Well, I guess. Well,
I did because I came from Pittsburgh, where it had this cervical cancer screening program.
Of course.
And that's where Larry Cooper and I got going, and I'm seeing a bunch of course, he was involved with the Fort Wayne study too. But he did a wonderful analysis that I've always enjoyed of that cervical cancer screening data, a nested case control study in the screening data where we had 4, I think he selected randomly 4, possibly 5 controls per case. And we did a very nice analysis on risk factors. And I really credit him. You know, I'm seeing another person. Do you remember Voors? V-O-O-R-S. I think it was Walter Voors. And I believe he had a somewhat of a German accent. He had an accent. And here I see him. I know I helped him with a paper in which he did sort of geographic mapping. It was a new concept to me. I mean, everybody knows, sort of assigning a small area a certain value, say, on social economic status based on indicators from that county or that small area. And I helped him a little bit. I guess he wasn't in fact, he and I shared an office for a while. And what I'm seeing here is a paper in 1969, and it looks like he had used my data from Pittsburgh, quantitative evaluation of a cervical cytology screening program, American Journal of Epidemiology. And where he went, his name hasn't come up before.
I haven't come across it.
So that must have been very early, Walter, V-O-O-R-S. And I don't remember.
I'll have to look him up and see.
But that's another faculty member from the early.
Oh, so he was actually a faculty member?
He was a faculty member, yes.
No, I've never come across his name before.
He was a faculty member. And so you were asking me, I'm sorry.
Well, when did you first, I mean, you taught an Epi 160, but then you taught another course
also.
also.
The other courses, yes, of course. And what I started, and I think I did this the second year. I started this the second year I was there. I could conceivably be wrong about how soon, but I know the first course I took had to do with healthcare. Utilization, healthcare utilization, quality of care measures, all the things we were working on in the health services Fort Wayne study. So that was the first, and basically I did quite a bit. Many of the articles that I had reviewed for the grant application, I used many of these articles as the basic material for the course. And covered different topics in that context, but related to health services research. And then, as I went on and did to do this work in cervical cancer, it was 1975 when the first article came out on hormone replacement therapy in uterine cancer.
Uh-huh.
And then we got into the business not only of uterine cancer, but of breast cancer, and case control studies here. And by that time, I was teaching a course on cancer epidemiology. So one semester I teach health services, and the next semester I teach cancer epidemiology.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the endometrial cancer and
Oh,
estrogen,
yeah.
because that was a huge saga.
Oh, that was a huge saga, and it was an important saga.
Mm-hmm.
That was because the endometrium is particularly sensitive to estrogen and estrogen alone.
Did you and Jerry have debates about, because that was something where the OBGYNs were recommending estrogens to women?
Well, I talked at quite a few OBGYN meetings, and they didn't always like me, but they would ask me back, and maybe partly because, you know, I had a little credibility because I was married to Jerry.
Never mind your degrees.
You know, never mind what I did.
Your husband.
But
because that was, my recollection is, I mean, and not personally, but from what I've read, is that originally it was a miracle drug because it rejuvenated women. And
I
took
think
away.
all that really was hyped up, that rejuvenation business. But I'm kind of giving a personal opinion.
Well, but it wasn't until a few years later that the reports started coming out about the rise in endometrial cancer. So initially, the hot flashes stopped and the other discomforts, and it was only a few years later, I think, that the statistics started showing the increase in endometrial cancer.
Well, I remember that New England Journal of Medicine article, 1975, because I reviewed it very carefully on endometrial cancer.
Was that, it was a case control study?
It was a case control study,
Mm-hmm.
and it was dramatic, and that really got us. And Bernie Greenberg was influential in getting us funding from Ayers Company, they made Premarin.
Mm-hmm.
And
Interesting. Bernie Greenberg helped you get the money from Premarin.
Bernie Greenberg, and if we get on here, Bernie Greenberg, I have papers with Bernie Greenberg.
Well, that was that very, I mean, in the interim, Alvin Feinstein and Ralph Horowitz came out with their paper about detection bias.
Yes, that's right. And
In New
we
England Journal of
had some
Medicine
debates. We had debates with Alvin Feinstein. I did on the issue. You're absolutely
And then
right.
well, that was when I was a student by then.
A detection bias.
I,
Oh yes, I remember this. Now.
Alan Wilcox told me this anecdote one time, that when the New England Journal of Medicine issue came out with the Horowitz and Feinstein paper, and there was an editorial by Ken Rothman in it.
Uh-huh.
And Ken Rothman and maybe, I can't remember who, but anyway, he said, well, you know, I read the article by Horowitz and Feinstein, and I was convinced. And then I read the editorial by Rothman, and I was convinced.
Yes. Both
So he didn't know what to do.
very fine intellects, all of them, you know, and they're very convincing.
But your study was one of the ones that really helped
well, yes,
provide the
and
key
we got
data.
and we got into breast cancer also. We had a breast cancer study, and we joined up also with folks at Duke who were doing a breast cancer study, and we and the data started showing it there too. In fact, all along I was probably a little more wary of the breast cancer issue. The clarity of the observation was by far the greatest, and the magnitude of the effect, to be epidemiologically correct, was by far the greatest with endometrium.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think as the Women's Health Initiative came out, 2000 plus, the data on the breast, if a woman does not have a uterus, then the use of estrogen alone has little effect on the breast. The breast is very much influenced by progesterone. Very much influenced by progesterone.
I didn't realize. So the combination.
Combination.
So when they
absolutely.
put the progesterone in to protect the endometrium, that was worse for the breast.
Exactly correct.
Huh.
That's exactly correct. So it became a conundrum unless a woman had had a hysterectomy. And of course now hysterectomies are so much less frequent, fortunately, than they were 30, 40 years ago.
So I don't know if you still follow this literature, but I recently, or someone put before me an article about challenging the findings from the Women's Health Initiative.
Really?
Based on the idea that in the Women's Health Initiative, they were putting women on estrogen often 10 years after menopause. And there's another study now that has come out, a smaller study, where women were treated right after menopause, or at the time, perimenopause, essentially, which is what it was. And that doesn't seem to show the problem. At least, if I mean, don't quote me on this. I need to go back and look at it. But that's what the person was saying, and this article seemed to be backing it up.
I don't know the data. From what I remember of long ago, I would believe it that certainly short-term use in the and that might be up to 3 years. Short-term use in the perimenopausal period was minimally.
Well, of course, you're speaking about breast cancer,
I'm
thinking about the cardiovascular, because that
you're thinking about the cardiovascular.
Well, because that was what the Women's Health Initiative really...
Yes. But it's interesting about the breast cancer, because it had a tremendous impact in terms of cutting back nationwide on the use of hormone replacement therapy, and the nationwide data on breast cancer
went down.
So, but what you're saying, I don't know the actual data. I don't know the papers. Something about it is whirring around my head, but I would certainly think it would be much potentially more damaging to start, in old age when you hadn't really hadn't hormones in your system for some years. Would make sense. But
I mean, again, I was focusing on the cardiovascular, but the breast cancer. Okay, I was as you were saying. But the breast cancer. I mean, I haven't been thinking as much about the breast cancer, but to actually have a population level decline in breast cancer as a result of a change in policy like that, one doesn't get too many of those.
You don't get too many of them. Yeah, I keep talking about breast cancer. You keep talking about cardiovascular.
No, we're going back and forth, ping pong. But interesting. That's.
Yeah. So anyway, some good things happen from epidemiologic research.
Well, indeed. I don't know if you've had a chance to see a paper I wrote. I gave a paper at the American College of Epidemiology.
Tell me.
Well, I will send it to you to read. But it was, the meeting last fall had the topic of making epidemiology consequential.
Okay.
Which was a topic that we chose partly because Sandro Galea had given this talk. He had come out with an article in the American Journal of Public Health, and he'd given a talk at SCR about we need to make epidemiology more consequential epidemiology. And so he has a textbook with that theme to it. And so my paper was saying, well, actually, epidemiology is consequential. And I listed this various number of things that epidemiology has accomplished. We wouldn't be alive today, a lot of us, if it hadn't been for epidemiology. So this is serious.
Great.
On the other hand, there are major areas of public health that epidemiology isn't really dealing with. And you pick up the newspaper, you listen to the radio, and there's all this mayhem going along. There's the violence, of course, but there's also, we have solutions for a lot of health problems, but we don't do anything about them because we can't bring ourselves to provide the health care that we know would make a difference. We know it would save a lot if we did such and such, but we don't do it because so much of policy is being driven by, I think, narrow-minded considerations. People who have lots of money and lots of power, but for some reason they are pursuing things in a narrow way and are harming themselves through it. I mean, like if you have people who are poor, undereducated, unhealthy, that's not going to help anybody. And one's own life is not necessarily better with an extra $1 million if the people around you are in this condition. And epidemiology hasn't yet figured out a way to start looking at why it is that people are behaving that way. Behavior not of the poor people, but behavior of the people who are making decisions and influencing things. So I'll send you my paper, and I'll be very interested in your thoughts on it.
I'd be very interested in seeing it.
It's the area I'm trying to develop now in my thinking. That's my retirement goal, phased retirement goal. is to be able to write some of these things up. And I've started making notes, but I haven't really, that's the only thing I've written out in a systematic fashion.
Wow, I'd be very interested. Where do you think the topics are that epidemiology should and could be tackling?
I think to get a better ability to conceptualize and measure mental processes, cognitive intelligence, awareness, problem solving. There's actually quite a bit of work coming out in neuroscience now about the perceptions, what influences perception, what influences judgments, inapparent race. I mean, we make these automatic decisions. There's this system 1 and system 2 thinking. There's the rational thinking process, but then there's the automatic one, and the automatic one kicks in first. So the rational one tries to hold it back, but in many circumstances, and hormones affected, and situational things, fatigue and so on, affect whether the rational system gets a chance to get involved. So there's a lot of decision making that is made before you even realize you're making the decision. And sometimes the rational process is rationalizing it. I don't want to take too much of our interview now, but I would love to come back and chat with you about it, and let me send you some things, because I can't really express it nearly as well as I would. But one of the things that I've done since the 70s actually is to read Science magazine. Sort of read it, not systematically, but keep up with it pretty much. And there is an incredible amount of literature that's come out now over the years about the brain. Biological research, psychological research, including studies where they measure brainwave patterns in relation to certain actions and perceptions and other kinds of measurements that they can do. And we are not what we think we are. We don't think the way we think we think. At least that's my shorthand way of putting it. And if epidemiology can define some of the variables and measure them, we can do observational studies and find that some people are this kind and some people, people who are generous and people who are not generous. What's the difference? Why is it that some people are more generous than others? Why is it that why will some corporate leaders do things that harm the environment? If a company is desperate to stay in business, that's one thing. But when you don't have that problem, and yet you're still despoiling the environment, and other companies, no, don't do that. What is it about the executives? And sometimes there's a change in the executive, and that makes a change. Or the financial crisis. What led these people to bring down their companies, to bring down the whole society practically, for gains? These were not poor people. No. These were people who were extremely wealthy, and yet they behaved in ways that were really pretty remarkable. Irresponsible, illegal, the whole works. And I think it's narrow awareness, just people, when people had to work very hard physically, everybody worked physically, and when it became possible not to, then a lot of us became sedentary, and then health began to show the effects of sedentary living. So we didn't make the shift, the environment changed, and we didn't then make corresponding changes to reflect that and eat differently and do more physical activity voluntarily and so on. And I think there have been changes in the social and economic environment, the technological environment, and people haven't adapted to that. So we're still operating in a mode that which is not really adaptive in the situation we're in now. Climate change is another one. Why would we want to destroy our planet? And why would people go and badmouth scientists for say climate change isn't real? It's extraordinary that you would do this. For what end? And there's abundant evidence. are all these scientists really conniving? It's only because they want grant money and so on that they're putting these things out there. It's just it's an insanity of sorts. And epidemiology, in principle, could be studying this, I think. It won't be easy, but of course, a lot of epidemiology isn't easy. You're always trying to tackle problems that you don't have the methods for, and you have to develop the methods. when you said, you did these measurements in cervical cancer, and the specimens weren't good enough, and maybe the laboratory techniques weren't good enough, but you keep working, and you get better specimen management and better laboratory techniques, and then you find out things. And I think we could be dealing with some of these problems, and we don't really have the luxury of not doing it. It may not be the greatest thing for one's academic career, because you can get more publications in this direction and so on, but if we're into if public health's what we care about.
Yeah, well, you got me thinking. I shouldn't say I've never, but many things you're talking about have become more prominent in the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting thought.
Well, I will send you this paper. I would love to continue, to chat about it some more, because I'm not moving it forward at the rate that I would like to be. And I've been playing around with these ideas for 20 years or something like that, in one way or another, and I'm trying to become more systematic about it. And so anyway, maybe after this segment we...
Sure.
So let me just make sure, I don't know how we're doing on time. How much more time do you have?
I'm not doing anything more. It's all how you're feeling. And
well, I'm fine.
Would you like anything? Would you like water? Or?
Maybe I could have a little bit of water,
sure.
And I'll pause this recording,
sure.
So it won't be a huge
Would you
file.
like ice cubes?
No, just actually plain tap water would be
okay.
fine.
That's basically all I have, because
good.
I drink tap water and I find it fine.